Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Williams. I'm an assistant fellow of the Presidential Elections Program. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I want to start with a little bit of housekeeping. I've been notified that slides that you've seen up here will be available on the Baker Institute website in about a week. So if you'd like to get that information, we'll have it for you. Uncertainty, it seems, is prevailing in our country today. Most Americans believe that the United States' best days are in the rearview mirror. Machines threaten our workforce. America's role in the world stage faces serious challenges. The candidate of one party may be impeached, and we won't know the eventual candidate of the other party for months and months perhaps to come. Amid the confusion, public distrust in U.S. institutions, politicians, and the media is on the rise. Never in most of our lifetimes has the political maxim that change is the only constant in politics has held such harrowing potential consequences. And so with that in mind, our next panel is going to study that very topic, trust and confidence. And they will explore the notion that America's trust and confidence are waning in our political and societal institutions. On the panel today, and thank you all for being here, appreciate it very much. On the panel today are Michael Demick, the president of Pew Research Center, who has been the co-author of several of the center's landmark research reports, including studies on long-term trends in American political values. Jennifer Merola, professor of political science at the University of California, Riverside. Her research focuses on how the political environment shapes individual attitudes and behaviors. Darren Shaw, a professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin, who also serves on the national decision team for Fox News and the Annette Strauss Institute. And Lynn Boverick, the Marvin Hoffberg Professor of American Politics and Public Policy at UCLA, and a contributing columnist to The Upshot in the New York Times. This panel, thankfully, will be moderated by Lisa Falkenberg, the editorial page director of the Houston Chronicle, who has a long string of journalism awards, including being the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in 2015. Thank you so much for being here.
I don't know.
Can we get a volunteer to go first?
Yeah, was there an order for us? Okay. Okay, watch the steps. All right.
Trust.
Trust, yeah. Great. Super, thank you so much for having me here. It's always great to be back in Houston. I went to undergrad here in Houston at University of Houston back in the late 80s. Didn't come to Rice often except to go to Valhalla, the grad student pub, for those of you familiar with that. Yeah, I'm here to talk a little bit about what I've linked together as trust, tribes, and technology. It's touching on a lot of the themes coming out of the first, but trying to get to the roots of where we are in trust in America today. The erosion of trust is broad-reaching. It's about institutions, and it's also about each other. And I want to really hit that point as I go through the slides. The heightened political polarization, I agree with the previous panel, is less about policy and ideology than it is about a greater level of animosity and even grievance about the political system and trends that we really feel on both sides are pushing against us, and a fear of the motivations of those on the other side. And then a part of this is the explosion of technology and what I refer to as disintermediated information. Instead of trusting others to curate information for us, we're in an environment where information's coming at us from all sides. So we're curating it ourselves, and that has real consequences because some of the mechanisms we use for curation in other parts of our lives maybe don't work as well when it comes to political information and news navigation. Trust was my first slide. This is a long-term slide of trust in government in the U.S. It's one of the earliest polling questions that was asked. It's a great example of polling questions evolution because when this was first asked, they said, well, how often do you trust the government in Washington to do what is right? Just about always, most of the time, or only some of the time. They didn't give a never. Today, never, if you offer it, is a pretty common answer people will go to. But as you can see, this is a combination of just about always, most of the time, which 73% were high on in 1958. Now, I really appreciate this slide we saw a second ago about how the post-war period isn't necessarily all of American history. It may have been a unique moment in American history, but that's when most polling trends start. So having data like Jeffrey showed us about other data sources is important to put that in some perspective. Now, you could do a whole talk about the ups and downs of trust in government, Watergate, all sorts of interesting trends that you see in here. But the issue we're talking about now is the last 10 plus years of extremely low trust in government in Washington, D.C. It's been holding steady like that, and a lot of the things that normally might turn trust in a positive direction, improving economic conditions, for example, don't seem to have moved trust in a positive direction. So what is mistrust in government today? Well, let's talk a little bit about what it isn't. It isn't about ideology, by which I mean this is not a growing share of Americans saying they want less government. In fact, one of the other old trends in polling is, do you want a bigger government that provides more services or a smaller government that provides fewer services? That hasn't been what's changing over this period of time. Americans are divided about 50-50 on a question like that. That's what's different today, actually, from the early 90s when trust was low, but Americans really wanted less government in their lives in the 90s. That's not the dynamic of this current environment. It's not about a lack of performance in the agencies and the ability of government to deliver. When we ask about individual agencies in the federal government, the vast majority of them get positive ratings for how they're doing their jobs. Even the IRS gets more positive than negative ratings for how it's doing its job today. And we asked about 12 different areas of roles that the government can play, from education to security, etc. Majorities say these are all really important things for the government to do, and in 10 out of those 12 areas got positive ratings for how it's doing them. So the actual performance of the government, it's not that it's perfect, it's not that we don't see deficiencies and inefficiencies, but it's not a performance issue at the government delivery level. And it's also not about state and local, which relates to that. State and local government ratings have remained very strong throughout this period where we've seen government ratings really go down. So what is it? It's very much focused on elected officials and the electoral system more broadly. Now, Americans have always been a little skeptical about elected officials. You can go back to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and any number of old movies. The media and elected politicians have never been portrayed particularly well, right? But there's a dynamic going on today where that seems to be really heightened. And a lot of that goes to deficiencies in the electoral system and sort of a sense of what's really important in our connection as citizens to our elected officials in Washington, something I refer to as a democratic deficit in general. We asked about 13 different areas in a survey earlier this year. How important are each of these to an effective democracy in our country? They talked about a wide range of different issues. And what we found is that there was a lot of agreement across party lines in the importance of all of these areas, and a lot of agreement across party lines in the absence of in a lot of these areas. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. The percent saying that it's very important in our democracy that elected officials face serious consequences if they engage in misconduct. 83% say that's a very important factor in a democracy. Only 30% say that describes our country even fairly well. So I've even lowered the bar for that category, right? The percent saying very well is even lower. The big gap there in how people see, they don't see elected officials as accountable. And this isn't just about Trump and impeachment. This is about a broader sense that elected officials aren't held accountable for their actions. We talked a minute ago about redistricting. 72% say it's very important for our democracy that congressional districts are fairly drawn. Only 49% say that even fairly well describes how our system operates. And then one that I think is really critically important, 78% say it's very important for our democracy in the US that voters are knowledgeable. And only 39% say that describes our country even fairly well today. Now, that is a relatively new phenomenon. This is a different survey question that we've been asking for a little bit over 20 years. How much trust and confidence do you have in the wisdom of the American people in making political decisions? And that went from about 2 to 1 close confident, very good or great deal of confidence, 35% not much, no confidence, and that's turned around over the last 2 decades with about 20 percentage points more saying lacking confidence in the wisdom of their fellow Americans when it comes to political decisions. Well, there's a lot behind that. Let me unpack a couple of those themes and flip to the second of my 3 T words, tribes. Now, we heard about polarization earlier, and I don't want to repeat too much of that, but it is true that party divisions are exceeding all of other divisions in American society today. This is a set of 10 different value questions, views about society and government in broadest sense. And what you see is that there are racial and religious and educational and gender divides and values in this country that have always been around, and they really haven't changed that much. What's changed is the average difference between Republicans and Democrats across these 10 questions. In 1994, the average difference between Reps and Dems was 15 points. Now it's 36 percentage points. Now, as we heard earlier, this isn't necessarily about the parties intrinsically getting more extreme. It's about more and more issues aligning along partisan lines, right? The sort of, what was the word you heard, Jeffrey? Bundling, or the more and more issues that don't intrinsically have an ideological connection to them, but all falling along partisan lines. 2 big examples. In 1994, environmental questions really didn't divide that much along partisan lines. A small difference, but mostly around regulatory issues, but really small. Now it's one of the biggest divides in our political system. Similarly, immigration. In 1994, there was almost no difference in the balance of opinion between Democrats and Republicans on immigration issues. Big, interesting differences within the parties, but not across partisan lines. Today, you couldn't be farther from that. So I also think it's important to say that polarization doesn't necessarily mean we are a more divided society intrinsically. For anyone who was around in the late 60s and early 70s, I think it's hard to say that the divisions in our country today are intrinsically deeper. I mean, even the level of divisiveness in households and families, violence in the streets, we're not seeing that, right? So before we think that this is a moment of deeper division, we should probably take a little bit of a pause on that. And it's also not necessarily about more extreme views. It's really about the alignment of more and more views along this singular left and right dimension. So that convergence and sorting of issues is a term that's often used in political science to talk about how a lot of issues are all now along this single polarized dimension. But also, and it was talked about earlier, identity level animosity, that party as an identity in our lives, the way we think about ourselves, and more importantly, the way we think about others, has become much more prevalent in our thinking. The caricatures and stereotypes we apply to others that Stephen mentioned earlier are very widespread. And the fear we have in the leaders of the other political party to not just disagree with us, but to really do harm to our country has really increased. It's very not, one part that we talk about is it's about negative partisanship. We're not more loyal and happy with our side. We're more fearful and angry with the other side in politics today. And I think importantly, we perceive that now. This is the conflicts between these different groups in our society are very strong or not very strong, and you see party rising to the top as the biggest perceived gap. So let me go over to technology for a second. There's a lot that's changing in the way we get informed in America. It's more online, it's more mobile, it's more social media, more filter bubbles or information silos. And you see I put a little asterisk next to each of those. I think we tend to overstate a lot of these trends and how widespread they are, but they are all meaningful. But I think at the critical level is there's more skepticism and even cynicism about information today, even the nature or existence of facts or the ability to even find facts today that I want to really conclude on. So let me just touch on a couple key trends. Yes, online is growing as the most frequently used source for information, but television is still the most popular way people want to get information, and more people do get information on television than anywhere else. That said, there's a huge generational signal to that, and of course the web is already the predominant source of information for younger generations rising, and not a lot of sense that they're developing other media habits as they grow older. When you look at the online environment, it's become much more mobile just over the last 5 to 10 years. This is a trend from 2013 to now in when you're getting news. Do you prefer to get it in a mobile device or on a desktop or laptop? I think that's consequential in the sense that now our information is both smaller, more morselized, and more mixed in with other kinds of information. We're getting personal information, we're getting commercial information, we're getting news and media and political information, sort of all blended in together. It's not segmented out into a half-hour program or a newspaper that we read while we're eating our breakfast. So our ability to process and navigate that information is happening in a very different context today. Social media is a big, big part of this. So the percent of adults in the dotted line who use each of these different platforms and the percent who say they get news on these different platforms. Facebook being the biggest source because it has the biggest audience and has a lot of news content in it. But you see, interestingly, 28% saying they get their news on at least some news on YouTube. That's an area we'll be studying more this year. That's not typically seen as a news source, but it's one that more people are referring to. The point here just being the wide diversity of sources, and that for most Americans, it's not even a single media or social media platform. And again, that blending of news with other kinds of information sources. So let me just close on this slide, which is about what it means for our trust and confidence in information. There are two questions that we asked in a survey a couple of years ago. We said, how often, if ever, do you come across political news online that's not fully accurate? And 51% say often, 27% say sometimes. Now, so that to me, that's a maybe good sign, right? We have a healthy dose of skepticism. News can move fast. The web is a pretty complicated space. You may be coming across news that you want to triangulate a little bit before you process it and think of it. And in fact, we see that in other questions that we ask. People definitely see the web as not necessarily always reliable and always trustworthy. So I think, okay, that's good. That's a healthy skepticism about an unmediated environment without gatekeepers, without curators. But the second question we ask is, how often do you come across political news online that's completely made up, right? And 32% saying they often come across completely made up news online, and another 39% saying sometimes. So this gets to the misinformation, disinformation, intentionally being misled. Now, this is an interesting question, and one that a lot of folks today are trying to put their measurement tools against. How much active misinformation and disinformation is there online? We've heard about Russia maybe did in 2016, and other players. We hear about actors. But I don't know that anybody puts the volume of active misinformation and disinformation in your Facebook feeds or in other media sources at this rate, right? I think that our healthy skepticism is almost turned to a cynicism about the ability to even get good information. And at that point, we're sort of separating ourselves out from being able to feel comfortable making informed judgments. The most important angle on this that we see in our survey to this conversation is, while most of us say we're pretty good at navigating information online, I'm pretty confident that I can tell the difference between truth and fact, between fact and opinion. I'm comfortable with my ability. I am not at all comfortable in your ability to do this, right? And that comes back to that slide I show you about our confidence in each other and the wisdom of the American people. I think it's a twofold set of factors that are driving that. One is the increasing polarization, this increasing sense that those people over there are so different from me. How can I trust their judgment at all? And then when they're exposed to this huge volume of misinformation and they're not able to process it and navigate it, why would I have confidence in them? Let me just end by adding the fourth T to this, which is Trump, right? I didn't put his name up there. But I just want to put out there, and maybe we can talk more in conversation, reinforce something that was said earlier. All of these trends started before Trump was president. All of these trends have a longer arc to them. Now, does that mean Trump is irrelevant to these trends? I don't think so. I think there are ways that many of these trends played to his advantage, or he used some of these factors effectively, whether it's social media or partisanship, et cetera, as a part of the way that he communicated effectively with voters and understood what their concerns were. And then the way he behaves as president probably accentuates and accelerates some of these trends. But he is not, I would say, the cause of this, more the symptom. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everyone. First, I want to thank the Baker Institute for putting on this really fantastic program. I'm excited to be here with you today. And Michael gave me the perfect segue because I will be focusing a bit on Trump, gender, and evaluations of government and government actors. Now, you're all likely familiar with this image. This is back from the 2016 election, a snippet from the Access Hollywood tape. And so the team of researchers that I work with at UC Riverside, we were really interested in the effect that information about allegations of sexual harassment or misconduct, what type of effect does that have on the electorate and how they evaluate government leaders and institutions, and in particular, how it affects women in the electorate. I will go on from here. Now, Michael already I wanted to step back to set the context for some of these questions, but I do not have to do that, so I can save a little bit of time. We've seen these long-term declines in trust in government, but I think a really important point that he brought up, this isn't just a result of Trump, We were at this kind of historic low point in trust even during the Obama era. And political scientists have really tried to understand, what are some of these forces driving this declining trust in government over time. And I think we'll hear a bit from Darren. One factor that's really been important is perceptions of corruption, So if those perceptions have increased, we've seen declines in trust in government. We also know from research that as individuals have come to distrust their neighbors more over time, we've also seen an increase in distrust in government. And we also know that the political environment is very consequential, for our trust in government. And so we've heard a lot about political polarization today, and there's been a bunch of fantastic research that shows, as polarization increases, trust in government has declined. And then also more specific environmental factors are found to be important. So for example, if individuals are dissatisfied with the economy, their trust levels may go down. If they're dissatisfied with political figures or the social fabric, we may also see declines in trust. And this is where I really want to which gets to the question that my team and I were interested in asking, and that's what role the contemporary political environment plays in affecting evaluations of government actors and institutions. And we were really interested specifically in looking at news and stories of sexual harassment and misconduct. And we wanted to look at whether this varies by gender and party. Okay, so we first wanted to look at some of the data that's out there and that's available. And so we turned to the American National Election Study trend in trust in government. And it doesn't really appear that there are many gender differences in trust in government, Women and men look pretty much the same, at least on this measure of trust in institutions generally. However, we do see some evidence of gender gaps if we look at specific political figures. So in this case, Donald Trump. So if you see here, the pink, I don't know if you can see from the back, but the pink are women and the blue line are men, and this is an ABC News poll from January of 2019, and there are pretty big gender gaps in perceptions with respect to whether Trump's honest and trustworthy, if he understands your problems, and if you have confidence in him to make the right decisions. And these, seem to be pretty big gaps that wouldn't necessarily be explained just by partisan differences in the gender gap in partisanship. There's also some research in political science that suggests that something about 2016 may have led to more problematic assessments of democracy. So this is a study that was done by David Campbell and Christina Wolbrecht, and this is with adolescents, So this is young people that they're looking at, and they did a study before the election, and then they did another study after. And so the pre-election is early in 2016, and then 2017 is after the election of Trump. And what you can see from this figure, Democrats, and both men and women, became more disillusioned with the extent to which the government can help people with their genuine needs. And that's what we'd expect, Usually partisans come to think that after their party loses. But the effect is much more pronounced among female Democrats, So there's some indications in research that, there may be differences between men and women in how they're reacting to these events in the political environment. But it's really hard to tease out with this data, is the news around Access Hollywood or allegations of sexual misconduct driving those evaluations and differences. And so that's one of the things that we wanted to try to explore a little more in depth. And so what we did was that we fielded our own study And so we drew a sample to be representative of the US population, and it's an online study. And so the key here, so a lot of my work is experimental, so I'll expose people to different types of information and then look at how it affects their evaluations. And so we randomly assigned people to read different news stories, and then they filled out a bunch of questions that were linked to evaluations of political leaders and government institutions. And then we also were really curious about their emotional reactions to politics and how it may have downstream effects in terms of their kind of future political engagement. And so a little more detail. So the vignettes that we had them read about, right? We wanted some baseline group that wasn't reading, right, about political news. And so we had them read a product review of Amazon's Alexa. It seems pretty neutral. And then we have a condition where people are reading about Trump. And I'll show you that in a second. And that's the one I'll be focusing on today, those results. We also had some treatment on Hillary Clinton. We were also interested in some reactions to Trump's election and other features of the political environment. So we had people, one subset read about the Women's March, and then another subset, which I may touch on if I have time, read about the Me Too movement, right? And so these were kind of the different vignettes we had, and they were all very similar. They followed a similar format, and I'll show you one of them. And so this is the one I'll be focusing on that, a subset of our sample read about, and that was Trump's treatment, and in this case, toward women. And so it brings up a lot of news, and these, the vignette was drawn from real news stories. Now, our study is in 2019, so an important thing to note is, for most people, this isn't new information, right? You pretty much would have had to have been living under a rock not to have known about the Access Hollywood tape during the election. So what we're doing is we're bringing this kind of news back to the forefront of people's minds to see how it affects their evaluations. And so we do actually reference the tape in the text. Okay, so the next thing we did, right, so in our study, right, a sample read this Trump treatment or read about Amazon's Alexa. That's our kind of baseline. Now we want to compare those two groups to see, right, what, if any, effect did this Trump treatment have on evaluations of government actors and institutions? And so what we did in our survey is people answered a battery of questions about how warmly they feel, right, toward Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and then a bunch of institutions. And it's on a 100-point scale, kind of like a thermometer. It's called a feeling thermometer, so higher values mean warmer feelings. So these are some of our results for feelings toward Trump. And so this is the effect among individuals who read that Trump vignette relative to those who read about that kind of baseline, non-political article. And these are a whole bunch of different models, so I really walk you through this slide, and then the other ones will go a little more quickly. So the top line, it's a little hard to see the colors, that's in the full sample. So really, and you can see there's this kind of line that goes down. So if the line is kind of overlapping, it means there's really no statistically meaningful effect, right? So in the full sample, we really don't find any effect of reading about Trump on feelings toward him. Okay, this isn't really new information for a lot of people, so it may not be particularly surprising. When we break that down by gender, we start to see kind of a negative but not quite statistically significant effect among women, so that's the pink line. And then if we break that further by gender and party, we see that there is a negative and significant effect, and it's among Republican women. And it's a pretty substantial effect. So their feelings toward Trump decline by about 16 units on that 100-point feeling thermometer. So they come to have cooler feelings. Now, for a point of comparison, right, if we do this for Clinton, we basically find no effect, right? So reading about Trump's treatment of women does not lead to kind of warmer feelings toward Hillary Clinton. There's really no effect, not for any of these divisions when we look by gender, by party. It also doesn't hold if we look, among Democratic men and Republican men. And so these are kind of feelings toward government actors. Next, we're interested in, does this spill over at all into how people feel about the political parties, right? And so this is the effect of the Trump treatment relative to reading about that control article in feelings toward the Republican Party. And we find basically a similar pattern, where it's really female Republicans who come to have cooler feelings, in this case toward the Republican Party, when they're reminded of, right, that kind of event back in 2016. But there's no effect among Democratic women, right, or among Democratic men or Republican men. They're not in the figure, but we didn't find any effects. If we do the same analysis for Democrats, we find the same thing that we find for Hillary Clinton, which is nothing, right? There's no movement in terms of feeling toward the Democratic Party when people read this treatment. Okay, so we may think, right, with some of the literature that I mentioned earlier about factors that influence trust in government, we may think, right, if we're seeing some declines in trust in actors, the political parties, this might spill over into feelings toward institutions. So we also asked about how people felt toward the US government, the US Supreme Court, as well as the US Congress, and we really find no spillover effects, right? So any effects we find are really limited to feelings toward actors and the political parties, and it's really among Republican women. And so this is just the effects on the full sample, but if I showed you the effects broken down by party gender, they look the same. There's just no effect there. Okay, so what I do want to show you, I only showed you one of our treatments, but I do want to show you some of the findings that did emerge as statistically significant for the other conditions, especially the one that's kind of related to issues of sexual harassment and misconduct, and that was the Me Too movement. And here, interestingly, we find effects among men, right? So men who read the Me Too kind of vignette and story came to have cooler feelings toward Donald Trump, cooler feelings toward the Republican Party, and in this case, they actually had warmer feelings toward Clinton and warmer feelings toward the Democratic Party. And so this is kind of interesting, and it may be that, the Me Too movement isn't as well known, right? That, certainly wasn't as salient as Access Hollywood, so there may be some learning going on when people are exposed to that condition. Okay, so this may seem, for the most part, like bad news, right? So if people are having all these negative evaluations, might this lead them to be less engaged in the political system, right? So sometimes if you have lower trust, you're less likely to be engaged. But our research suggests that's not the case. So I had mentioned earlier some of the things we looked at were emotional reactions to our treatments. And we found, for example, that both Republican women and Democratic women more substantially reacted with greater anger when they read that kind of vignette about Trump. So they had greater anger, so that's a negative emotion, but what we know about negative emotions like anger is that they're very motivating, right? So what we found was this then had downstream consequences and made them more likely to engage in the political system, right? So we were finding kind of engagement effects. And we found it to a lesser extent when people read about the Me Too movement or the women's marches, and that was primarily among Democratic women in those cases. And some other scholars have also found some similar patterns. So going back to that Campbell and Wolbrecht study, they found, right, kind of the group, if you remember earlier, that was most disillusioned after the election were young female Democrats, but they found that that group was also more likely post-election to say that they were interested in being involved in protests in the future, right? So we again see this kind of engagement effect. So just to summarize, right, we're finding some evidence, at least in the context of our kind of one, experimental study, that issues around sexual harassment and misconduct are shaping, evaluations of government actors and institutions, at least among some segments of the electorate. However, these forces don't really seem to have much effect on support for institutions more generally, right? So evaluations of institutions at least are pretty sticky in reaction to this particular context. And we do see some positive developments, at least in the sense that, right, some segments of the electorate, especially women, are becoming more politically engaged. So I will close with that.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank the Baker Institute in general, but also Mark Jones for the invitation, as well as Secretary Baker. I do have a brief anecdote on this question of measuring trust and confidence in individuals and in government. One of my first jobs was in 1992. I was working with Fred Steeper, who was President George H.W. Bush's pollster. And I think it was June 1992, we did a fairly massive survey, not only on attitudes in the election, but also on attitudes towards individuals in the cabinet. And so Dick Darman and Colin Powell, but also Secretary Baker. We used the thermometer scale that people have talked about, a 0 to 100 scale, and results came back just horrendously for Secretary Baker, who we had identified in the poll as Jim Baker. Those of you with a little bit of memory will recall there was another Jim Baker running around at the time. So we had to present this finding. Fred, fortunately, had to go and do it. I didn't. And I said, well, maybe the secretary won't notice that he's missing from this list. And Fred turned to me and said, have you ever met Secretary Baker? In the next poll, he was identified as James A. Baker III. But just, as a measure of humility when it comes to trying to get at some of these concepts, I wanted to put that on the table to start. So I'm going to take a particular slice of this, as I guess all of us are in some sense. I have a general research question that involves this concept of trust and how it works. The more general kind of rubric, I guess, that we're thinking about these things are how Americans think about their government. How is it that their attitudes about whether the government is corrupt, whether it is competent, do they trust government, actually affect political participation, which is something that Jennifer talked about just a second ago. And that's actually kind of a building block for what I'm interested in. Strangely enough, political science hasn't really done a lot of research in this vein. There's some stuff, but there's not a lot. And in fact, if you go back to the institution that most kind of forcefully and importantly engaged this question was actually the Supreme Court in the 1976 Buckley case, in which the court was considering whether the Federal Election Campaign Act was constitutional. In other words, were limitations on contributions and expenditures constitutional? And our data, and the project I'm involved with, which was with Brian Roberts and Mijong Bayek at the University of Texas, actually is called The Appearance of Corruption. And it takes an empirical look at what the court offered us. So in this sense, we're kind of moving behind the court, who put this thing on the table over a quarter of a century ago. So the problem that the justices were considering in the Buckley case is a specific notion of when can the federal government regulate political speech. And of course, those of you any familiarity with the law know that, well, it's a fundamental freedom, therefore it can only do so under circumstances where there is a compelling state interest, and the solution has to be narrowly tailored. So this raises an interesting question, right? Why or under what circumstances could you justify the limitation of political speech in democracy? And the court offered a couple of different possibilities. The first was they said, well, if you're going to equalize speech, that is, if there are imbalances in speech, rich versus poor or black versus white, there might be a reason to limit speech under those circumstances. The second, the one I'm going to focus on, is corruption mitigation. That is to say, you could regulate speech if, in fact, you're attempting to mitigate corruption. But they didn't just say corruption. So here's the equalization argument, the corruption mitigation argument. But they didn't just say corruption. They talked about a particular kind. And I believe this is one of the very first instances I've seen where the court actually didn't simply invoke a concept or an action, that is corruption. They said Congress could legitimately conclude that the avoidance of appearance of improper influence is also critical if confidence in the system of representative government is not to be eroded to a disastrous extent. So they're not talking about quid pro quo corruption as the only criteria. I've got the plus here to indicate they're talking about they could regulate speech simply to avoid the appearance of corruption on the part of the public. So this is getting into our alley, right? This is actually invoking public opinion as an appropriate measurement or standard by which the court could regulate free speech, right? So that's our point of departure. The Supreme Court actually posits a model, a testable model of political behavior, which runs something like this. You can have campaign finance laws. These laws presumably will lower corruption, real or imagined, right? So in actuality or simply the public's perception of corruption, right? The less apparent corruption there is, the more trust in government. This is obviously the focus of this panel. And then more trust in government will lead to greater political participation. So a nice set, this is better than political science does this, a nice set of testable propositions that the court advances. They've never been tested empirically, right? And there are some scholars who are kind of picking up on this. There's some research out there, but the effort of our project is to actually figure out, did the court get it right? And the answer is some ways yes, some ways no. Right? But in essence, though, the core proposition here is that participation is essential to the integrity of the process, and if you can enhance the prospects for participation, you can justify, limiting speech. All right. Now, so what is it that we think that Americans know? Well, they believe that there's too much money in politics. All of the public opinion data shows that. They also believe that there should be more regulation of money in politics. We're all down for regulating campaign finance. They also believe that these regulations don't work. And yeah, you're laughing, I'm laughing because it seems to be kind of very consistent with what my friends and neighbors think about this. What is it that Americans know? Very little. You know, you guys have probably all heard this, but the standard data that we see shows, for instance, that 75% of Americans can name the vice president, which means 25% cannot. 45% can tell you the majority party in Congress, which is wonderful given that it's a 50-50 chance. More Americans, I believe, know who lives in a pineapple under the sea than know who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But what we do see is that they actually know less the more newspapers they read. Now, this is a particular finding with respect to campaign finance reform. When you're exposed to a lot of media, you tend to greatly overstate the amount of money that's in politics. And you also tend to think things like the corporations can legally give to individual campaigns, which they can't. So the more exposed you are to media, the more likely you are to get some of these campaign finance questions wrong. All right, so let's start with the first part of the court's assumption here, corruption. We asked several questions now we've got data pre and post Citizens United, because we thought Citizens United was a really important kind of landmark case. It could very easily be argued that Citizens United changed our perceptions of corruption. That is, Americans are more likely to think the system is corrupt in the wake of Citizens United. So we wanted to test before and after Citizens United. So what you have here is data. Actually, let me go back here and get this right. Sorry. Oh, can I not go backwards? Oh, now I'm really in problems. Uh-oh. I thought the backwards meant backwards, but let's go back here. Here we go. Okay, cool. So let's go back here. All right, how often do you think politicians base their votes on a legislative bill on the preferences of campaign contributors rather than constituents? All right, all of the time is the blue bar, often is the orange. So in other words, overwhelmingly they say that at least often, but all of the time is a certainly responsible answer to this question. They basically think that our politicians are bought and sold, at least a significant portion of the time. That number hasn't changed appreciably since 2016 in the post-Citizens United wake. Okay, how much influence do each of the following groups or entities have on Congress? These are ranked from high to low, so you see Super PACs scores highest. The blue bar here is 2016 data, the orange bar is 2009, so when I could, these are pre and post Citizens United numbers. Super PACs weren't really a thing prior to 2009, prior to Citizens United, but you take a look, who do we think influences Congress? Super PACs, lobbyists, contributors, your own party, other members of Congress, then you get down to the White House, ideology, staff, and last and least is members' constituency preferences. All right, so there's a healthy degree of belief that the system is corrupt. This is just a simple measure that we ran combining two particular responses to items on corruption on a 1 to 8 scale, and you can see that there's some people in the middle, but most people tend to score on the high side of this perceived corruption scale. All right, and this isn't a new thing. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but what you get here is this is national election study data going back to the 1960s. The blue line here, which is spiked up lately, that's the percentage of people who think the government is run for a few big interests as opposed to the benefit of all. Okay, there's an interesting little blip up after 9/11. We got a little bit more trusting of government in the aftermath of 9/11, but that's really the only exception across this time series. This is the percent saying that government officials are crooked. What you get in the blue line here is quite a few are crooked. Okay, so significant data suggesting that people think politicians are corrupt, that the system is corrupt. This is just the results of a multivariate regression, so that's mention number 3 on the day for those of you who are counting. What affects it? So what is it that makes people more likely to say there's corruption? Knowledge of campaign spending. So that is people who have fairly accurate perceptions of how much money there is in political campaigns. That's significantly correlated with increases in perceived corruption. If you know that there are actually limits on special interest participation in politics, you can effectively identify those, you're less likely to see the system as corrupt. So there's actually 2 different kinds of knowledge here, and they move in opposite directions, as you might think. We actually tested whether people from states where there are significant limits on campaign finance are also less likely to see the system as corrupt. No, that's not really the case. So you see here, this is should be thought of here as limits on corruption. So if you're in a state where there's limits on campaign finance and campaign spending, it's positively associated with perceptions of corruption. Okay, and we can get into that in the Q&A if you'd like. And then, is it the case that more money in the system influences corruption? Not really. You see, in fact, that the more money there was in campaigns per capita across this range, it didn't really have much of an effect at all. In fact, a very, very slightly negative effect on perceived corruption. There's more money, slightly less perceived corruption, although it's not statistically significant, so we wouldn't take that too seriously. I mentioned campaign finance, just a single thing here. This is on a 0 to 10 scale, support for different campaign finance reform measures. It ranges from outside interest groups should be forced to disclose their contributors, all the way down to the one with the least support is candidates for federal office should be able to receive unlimited contributions so long as they're fully disclosed. And that's kind of middling. Everything else gets huge support. And I'll skip the slide and just have to trust me on this, pun intended. That people are kind of ambivalent about whether they think those things will work. All right. So you transition it. So that's perceived corruption. It's absolutely a thing. It doesn't seem to be influenced in quite the way the court thinks by campaign finance reforms and regulations, which is interesting. Trust and confidence. This is just some data that we have from a very recent poll in October of 2019, where blue indicates a great deal of trust, or some. So some are a great deal of trust in the different institutions, and they're arrayed from least trusted to most. So you see, we're trustful of the military, police and law enforcement, public schools, not so much Congress, the news media, or the presidency. What about different professionals? So move from the aggregate to the individual. We love our doctors, right? They score high. The blue indicates a lot of, some or a lot of trust and confidence. We don't really like Wall Street executives, which is something that seems to have permeated the Democratic primary rhetoric. However, I like to put Wall Street executives in there because they're the only ones that score lower than congressmen. All right, again, these are the trust numbers. Jen showed this, I think Michael showed these as well, just bearing out this notion that it's essentially the percentage who don't trust the government has increased over time. All right, so we talked about corruption attitudes and trust. What about this connection between, is it true that if you have lower perceived corruption, you have higher trust in government? That's absolutely true. So the court got that right. If we could, in fact, lower perceived corruption, trust would increase. That's absolutely the case. But it's not the case that people in states with stricter campaign finance regulations trust the government more. That doesn't seem to be correct. All right? And then there's some interesting effects going on with other sorts of variables. All right, so let's get to the end game here. What about engagement? So what I've got here is just overtime data from the National Election Study, where the red line here indicates somewhat interested. The orange line here, which has spiked up lately, indicates the percentage of people saying they're very much interested in politics. This is just an initial look at engagement. So it looks to be the case that actually interest in politics is somewhat increasing over time. All right? Here's voter turnout, 1996, which was a low point, up to 2016. So in terms of presidential elections, turnout is increasing slightly, since the mid-90s certainly. All right. So it's also the case that the percentage of people saying that they do or engage in certain sorts of political activity is fairly significant, although it varies enormously. So at the top, you've got here, discuss politics with family or friends. All right, and then at the very, not next to the bottom, you've got participated in a discussion or protest. I'm not quite sure how discussion and protest are lumped together there, but so you see high demanding activities versus low demanding. And what you find is there's a lot of people who say they talk about politics, lots of people say they vote. 26% say they've donated money to a cause, political cause, over the last year. 25% say they've contacted an elected representative. Now, do we trust them? Probably not so much. So these numbers are probably overstated a little bit, but actually these numbers are quite striking. These are very high levels of engagement. So what do people think about this connection between corruption and engagement? We asked a straightforward question. If you think the overall level of corruption surrounding an election is high, are you more likely to vote in that race, less likely, or doesn't that affect your voting? So the orange here is actually the more likely. The gray in the middle is it won't affect me, and the blue is less likely. Now this is self-reported, but people actually say, if there's a corrupt election, I'm more likely to vote. Do they actually do it? Yeah, ooh, there's my timer. Nice, okay, good, we're almost on that slide. So this is the overall relationship between the elements of the court's behavioral model and participation. And so I've got pre and post Citizens United, and so I've got participation, all those 13 or 14 measures, as well as turnout alone, and looking at the relationship between perceived corruption, trust in government, campaign finance regulation, and spending on engagement and on participation. In fact, what you find, if you look across the top, right, that the relationship between perceived corruption and participation and turnout is not significant. In fact, if you go back to pre-Citizens United, it was significant but in the wrong direction. That is, if you thought the system was corrupt, you were more likely to vote or participate. This is really consistent with Jennifer's notion. This leaves me in a very difficult situation. My normative prescription then, logically, would be more corruption, would lead to very high turnout. I think I want to end there, but I do want to suggest that the court got part of it right and part of it wrong. They had this very interesting model, but there's a complex relationship between attitudes towards corruption, political trust, and political participation. It's absolutely the case. When we think the system's corrupt, it does affect systemic evaluations. But Americans have an interesting reaction when they think their system's failing them, and that is they want to go participate. So with that, I'll conclude.
All right, I'll add my thanks to the rest of the panel for having me, and thanks to the Baker Institute for bringing us all together to think about 2020. I'm going to wrap up by raising this question that a number of people have touched on. Where do we see declining trust? Is it in institutions, or is it possible that where we have declining trust is with each other? And then I'm going to think a little bit about ways that we might increase trust among each other. And I'm going to start that story by telling you about these two gentlemen. So on the left, you see Rakeem Jones, and on the right, you see John McGraw. And John McGraw goes by the nickname Quick Draw McGraw. These two gentlemen met at a Trump rally during the 2016 presidential campaign. The thing that Rakeem Jones never saw coming was the punch that he got in the belly from John McGraw as he was being escorted out of the rally by police. So Mr. Jones and his friends were protesting at the rally. Mr. McGraw was there as a supporter, and they ended up in conflict with one another. Now, when a roving reporter managed to find Mr. McGraw at the end of the rally and ask him, "Did you see what happened?" He said, "Well, I was what happened. I did it. I punched that guy." And the reporter says, "Well, why? Why did you do that?" And Mr. McGraw said, "Well, we don't know if he's ISIS. We don't know who he is. The next time we see him, we might have to kill him." And then John McGraw said this: "He's not acting like an American." Okay, and so to me, this is sort of a great entree into this question that emerges in 2016 and after. What does it mean to be an American? And now, what does it mean to be an American in 2020 as we move into this next presidential campaign? So maybe the declining trust is with one another, as these two gentlemen illustrate, but I think that our institutions maybe aren't the cause of the decline, but they can help us in restoring some of the trust and faith we have in one another. So I'm going to throw that out there and let you guys think about if you think there's anything to this idea. So at the end of this Jones-McGraw story, I will tell you that these two gentlemen end up in court together over a year later. Donald Trump, despite saying, you know, throw eggs at these people, the media mostly, I'll pay your legal fees. He did not pay Mr. McGraw's legal fees, but they do end up in court, and they end up hugging. They embrace one another, and they say to each other, "This is bigger, this got away from us, it's bigger than you and me, it's about the country now, and we should set an example." So maybe that's the example of where we can go in 2020. So can elections and candidates, these are my institutional suggestions, can elections and candidates help us restore trust in one another? And I'm going to tell you the story of presidential campaign as if it were a theater. So there is the setting of the stage, and that is going to be about the nation's economy. So we're going to do a little stage dressing and a little work in the theater with the economy. Then we have to write the play. And that's where the candidates come in. They're going to frame these elections for us. But as everyone knows, the play's the thing. And so the stories that these candidates tell are going to be vitally important to what plays out in front of us. So I want to talk about those three elements as we think about whether elections and candidates can help us in 2020. So setting the stage, number one thing about the economy and presidential election outcomes, this works in the United States, this works in other countries as well. Incumbent parties in growing economies typically win elections. Okay, challenging parties in declining economies typically win elections. So if you know what the growth rate is in the country in the first 6 months of a presidential election year, if it's growing, chances are that incumbent's going to get reelected. Now, as Darren pointed out, two political parties, you got a 50-50 shot of guessing which party's going to win a presidential election because there are only two. But if you know what the growth rate is, you'll be right 75% of the time. So you can do better than flipping a coin by knowing the growth rate. So this sort of sets the stage for what kind of story the two parties are able to tell. So what is the storyline going into 2020? What play will be written? Candidates are going to frame this election. If the economy doesn't help one of them, then that person has to find something that does help them. So they need a storyline that isn't about the economy. But it can't just be any storyline. It has to meet some criteria. The first thing, public opinion on whatever this story is going to be about has to be lopsided. It doesn't do any good to refocus the election onto an issue on which the public is divided 50-50. You only get half the votes. Your opponent gets the other half. So you're looking for issues that are lopsided. Second thing, you're looking for issues on which you are closer to most voters than your opponent. You do all that hard work, you refocus the election off of the economy and onto this other thing, and then it turns out you helped the other guy. That seems very straightforward, but you guys follow politics closely. You know sometimes candidates get this wrong. Okay, Barry Goldwater went around, we heard about 1964 earlier this morning, telling people, no, a little nuclear power is just enough. I want to lob one into the men's room of the Kremlin and make sure it hit. So he was not on the popular side of this issue. In 1964, most Americans thought that they were going to die in World War III. He was out talking about how they shouldn't feel that way. Okay, so the last thing is whatever this lopsided public opinion issue is, it has to be a topic that is already important or can be made to be important. So poor Newt Gingrich in 2012 going around campaigning, talking about colonizing the moon, probably not making that the most important issue of the 2012 election. Okay, so you got some work to do. If the economy is not going to help you, you've got to find this storyline. Lopsided public opinion can be made to be important or is important already as an issue. And those two criteria I'm going to bring up again at the end as we think about what 2020 is likely to be about. So what was the play about in 2016? Donald Trump not benefiting from the economy. It was a middling, slow-growing economy, but he wants to change the storyline, make America great again. The again was really important to him. America was once great, is not now great, but can be great again. And he told that story by talking about groups, in-groups and out-groups, us versus them. And he wove in what I call identity-inflected issues, security and safety, but through a lens of building a border wall to keep Mexicans out, to keep immigrants out, a Muslim ban. So although these are policy issues that we have talked about a lot, in 2016 they get inflected through these identity groups. And that was the story in 2016. Will that be his story in 2020? This is a question. So to give you some sense of whether there was, we heard earlier that Donald Trump didn't create these attitudes. They started long before he came into office. And I just want to show you a little bit that as you're thinking about crafting messages, it's important to think about who's mismatched or who's out of step with political parties. And what I'm showing you here, and I want you to focus on these that I've circled, these are white voters who voted for Barack Obama in 2012. And I have surveyed them in 2011 and asked them these questions. So do you think illegal immigrants are mostly a drain on society? And the survey is telling us that 32% of white Obama voters in 2011 thought that immigrants were a drain on society. And the other mismatches there are equally as relevant to that storyline in 2016. 34% of white Obama voters wanted to make it harder for people to immigrate to the US. So good stories are going to steal voters who are mismatched with their candidate or mismatched with their party. Now, it's not that that people didn't think that they were mismatched. This wasn't an issue of contestation in 2012. Mitt Romney, Barack Obama were not talking about this dimension the way that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were talking about it in 2016. Why is that? That's because the play was different. Trump wrote a different script than was written in 2012. Okay, so we want to think about what script is coming in 2020. In the aftermath of 2016, the parties are diverging. The country is moving to the left. That is largely because Democrats are becoming more liberal and Republicans are holding steady. So what I'm showing you here is over time, this question, immigrants today strengthen the country because of their hard work and talents. And this is the percent of people within each party that agree. Democrats are increasing their agreement with that, and Republicans, they're increasing a little bit as well. But you can see the gap in 2008 is very small between the parties, and the gap in 2016 is very big. And I could draw you this picture on a lot of different issues, and it would look the same. This increasing gap is on this question about racial equality, and that there's inequality across the races due to discrimination or due to lack of hard work among some races. And you can see here, Democrats are saying, no, it's because of discrimination. The share of people saying that is increasing. And so the gap between the parties is getting bigger. So maybe less areas where we agree. But that's where I'm going to throw a wrench into the works and say that there are areas where people agree across the parties. There are things on which we have overwhelming agreement. And to show you that and to suggest that there's a way for an entrepreneurial candidate to emerge on the scene in 2020 and highlight these issues on which we have agreement, restore some faith in each other, that there are common goals that we have. This is not an impossible idea. Maybe this is the answer to the question from the first panel that ended in like maybe prayer. I have a suggestion that's maybe a little more concrete. So these data are coming from a project called Nationscape that is sponsored by the Democracy Fund that I'm running with my colleague at UCLA, Chris Tasanovich. And we are interviewing 6,000 people a week, every week. We started in July of this year, and we will go through the inauguration in 2021. The goal at the end is to have a rich data set to tell the story of the country across space and time. We will have 1,000 people in every congressional district by the time we're done. So I'm going to take these data and I'm going to tell you about a little game that we have people play. We present them with two baskets of goods, two sets of outcomes, and we ask them to choose which state of the world would you rather live in. And we show them outcomes like there's a Green New Deal, the president is impeached, we've cut taxes on households earning less than $100,000 a year, and then we have the opposite of those things. And we mix those up randomly together. We ask people to choose which basket of goods they would rather live in the world, live in that world. And so as you can see, if you're a big fan of cutting taxes on households under $100,000, and you will always choose that, no matter what else is in the set. And so the way you make those choices reveals to us what issues have high impact in the population and what outcomes people are willing to trade away to get the things they want. So what we are trying to do is separate out public opinion or people's attitudes about outcomes. We're for the Green New Deal, we're for raising taxes. Okay, separate out what people are for and against from how important these issues are to their decision making. So in those two criteria I told you about when you're searching for your issue to run on, you got to find the lopsided issue. That's what people think, but it has to be on an issue that can be made to be important or already is. And that's the impact or priorities. And that's what I want to show you here. So start with Democrats. This is based on 108,000 interviews that we've done so far nationwide. These are the most important things to Democrats. And the way to think about this is whether to separate immigrant children from families, whether to impeach Trump. This is the priority regardless of what people's position is. Now, it turns out that most Democrats have the Democrats in our sample are lopsided on these issues, and so I'm just showing you here which direction public opinion is going. So they do not want to separate children, they want to impeach Donald Trump. Impeachment there, the second most important outcome for Democrats. No ban on abortion, don't build the wall. What does it look like for Republicans? Well, there again is impeachment as the #1 priority. But here, Republicans are leaning in the other direction. Don't impeach the president. Don't ban guns, no slave reparations, build the wall, showing up in both parties as a high impact issue. Okay, so then what everybody wants to know is, well, what about the swing voters? What about the independents? And here you can see, even for independents, whether to impeach the president is the #1 high impact issue. And public opinion is divided for independents. Among people who have an opinion, 55 say yes, impeach, 45 are saying no, do not impeach. And then independents are a mashup of the other two parties. So you can see their second most high impact issue, don't separate immigrant children, just like the #1 issue for Democrats. Their third, don't ban guns, just like the second most important issue for Republicans. So some sense that these independents really are not choosing a party identity because they have a different collection of issues than either party holds in terms of what they think is important and how they're going to make choices. So I want to just direct you, if you're interested in exploring how these issues play out in terms of impact and opinion for both parties, you can go to the New York Times website. We published these in the Times on Thursday. And you can scroll over the dots and you can read what everything is. And the way to read this is across the horizontal axis. That's the support for the policy. So things on the right-hand side have high support. This is for Republicans. And then up and down is the revealed importance. So things at the top are high impact to people. So in the right-hand corner, high impact and really lopsided. So if now you're thinking about where can I steal some votes? I'm a Democrat. I want to steal some Republican votes. Well, here's Dreamer Path to Citizenship. About 70% of Republicans say they are in favor of a Dreamer Path to Citizenship, and it's a relatively high impact issue already. So you can probably make that important. And then low-income health subsidy, giving a financial subsidy to low-income households for health care. So those might be some issues that Democratic candidates can weave into a story in 2020. Here's the graph for Democrats. Don't ban guns. So about 65% of Democrats don't raise taxes on families making over $250,000. So there are some commonalities across the parties. And oops, sorry, there's a little bit of a squishing there of the rank. But what I'm showing you here are among independents. These are issues, and the rank in importance is in the first column. Public opinion on these issues is in the second column. So these are all lopsided issues. Potentially, these are the people who can be persuaded or stolen if the campaign is about these things. These are independents. Okay, so how do we fare when we look at Democrats? Well, I picked these issues on purpose. These are issues on which Democrats have also lopsided public opinion. So these are ripe for a campaign message. The problem is that they're not very high impact. There are 50 total considerations that we ask about. So when you start getting into the high 20s and the 30s, 40, this is not a high impact issue. So you would have to do a lot of work if you wanted to make eliminating the estate tax something that the campaign was going to be about. But look at how lopsided public opinion is on all these issues. These are things on which we all agree, and Republicans as well. Public opinion is lopsided, but again, the impact level is not very high. So when we peel away attitudes from impact, we can see how we do agree. There are things that everybody wants to have happen, but we just disagree on how important they are. And what happens is Democrats and Republicans will trade away these things to get the stuff at the top of their list. Impeach the president, don't impeach the president, don't separate children, don't ban guns. Okay, so to wrap up, where does that leave us for the storyline for 2020? Is there a unifying theme that can be built out of these lopsided issues on which people across parties and independents agree? There are things. People don't care about them very much. But can you tell a story? And so what would it be about? Some of these things can be made to be important. So universal gun background checks, maintaining a strong military. So that is sort of a security story, but with a sensible security story, right? We want a strong military, but we want gun background checks. We don't want to ban guns, okay, safe guns. We want maternity leave, 12 weeks of paid maternity leave, a dreamer path to citizenship. Those are sort of about public well-being. We want a public option for healthcare, not Medicare for all. That's not in the same set, but a public option and lower taxes on low-income households. So all of you political strategists in the room, take those set of things, which I think you're all professionals. You can come up with the story of 2020 that can become the play that we see in 2020 and makes us restore trust in one another. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, well, I've asked questions for a living, and I've just been told I have one, and then I negotiated to two. So sorry about that. You guys had some really good questions. I'm gonna be selfish and ask a question that relates to my field, media, because I think a lot of people touched on it in theirs. So something that I face daily is knowing that there is a trust issue, but it's kind of the paradox of transparency and free press. We hope as journalists that if we report wrongdoing, people will become aware and the problems will be corrected. But the negative nature of coverage is kind of imperative if you want that to happen. We don't report on the planes that land safely, we report on the planes that don't. But what happens, how does the negative focus of the media, newspapers, more so on TV maybe, skew public perception? If I'm doing my job, I'm reporting the negative. But if you're reading the paper every day and you're reading negative, 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 how does that affect and skew perception? Are we doing damage by reporting the wrongdoing? Too much. How do we balance that? Anybody want to weigh in?
Yeah, you know, Jon Stewart's been retired for a couple of years now, but most of my students over the past 2 decades have gotten their news from The Daily Show. And the distinction I always raise with Jon Stewart, who I think is incredibly funny, is the distinction between cynicism and skepticism, which Michael talked about earlier. I think what's happened, especially with a show like that show is at its core cynical, not skeptical, cynical. And the difference is between, you know, if I asked to, you know, if Lynn says something, I say, that's interesting, Lynn, why do you hold that opinion? That's skeptical. If I say, Lynn, who bought and sold you? And that's a distinction that I think is we've really kind of crossed the Rubicon on that. And I'm not talking about the Chronicle or even necessarily the Times, but it's seeped into our culture, and as there's so many different outlets and modes of getting information, I think that cynicism, which I think ultimately is corrosive. I think there's a really interesting line. I think skepticism is at the core of proper democratic functioning, and I think cynicism is corrosive. Mm-hmm. And I fear that we've crossed that line a little too generally and too pervasively, and I think that's contributed to increased lack of trust in government.
Mm-hmm. So the answer is balancing, positive. When a politician does something right, you
no, I actually think it's the distinction between attribution of motive. Mm-hmm. You know, mm-hmm. We can have disagreements, but they can be thoughtful, they can be respectful, they can be grounded in genuine ideological differences or policy differences, as opposed to, you know, I take the gun, you know, debate we were talking about. I mean, when I talk to my Democratic friends, it's like, well, they all know that the Republicans are bought and sold by the NRA. And it's like, okay, that's, that's interesting. But I think that's become far too common, in our understanding of news. So it's not necessarily the negative. I think it's the motivation that I object to, I guess.
Okay.
I would just add that it also depends on the way in which people react to that negative news. And so, if people are a little bit anxious because of negative news, it can actually lead to kind of more thoughtful and careful processing. People are more likely to look for a number of different sources. But if it leads to anger, and that could be, right, if you're kind of blaming people for outcomes, right, that can generate more anger. And then people are more likely to look for kind of biased information sources. So it can have those kind of, different types of consequences depending on the, emotional reaction to that negative information.
I thought this was an interesting one. How can we trust polls? That's what you guys do for a living. How can we trust polls after polls missed the mark in the last political election? Are these techniques obsolete? So how can you be confident in what you've just told us up there?
I will speak for the pollsters on the panel, and just so that they don't feel like they have to brag too much. But this is such a common question, and the fact of the matter is, I think it was Pew who did this very nice graphic, and I'm sure if you go to their website you can find it. Starting in 1936 with the first presidential election poll going to 2016, and they graphed the misses. How bad were the polls off across all these presidential election years? And what you will see is the bars get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and 2016 is the smallest. So national polls were more accurate in 2016 than they were in any prior presidential election year in the history of presidential election polling. Now, that doesn't mean that there were not problems with the state polls and that there aren't things to learn about how to construct these samples. But I think it is a hasty conclusion to say, I don't believe any poll. The science of polling is healthy and robust and growing.
I would add, thank you. I would add, which it is true. Part of it, though, is being a healthy consumer. I think that, look, polling is an inaccurate science. Wording matters, as we've talked about a little bit here. But at the end of the day, we are taking samples out of a mixed group of people with different views and values. And I think our desire, particularly in an election cycle, for a level of precision about who's up today and who's down is our expectations are far above what polling can deliver. And I think we've gotten the illusion that by aggregating a whole lot of polls together, that increases that accuracy down to the point where we really can take a small change to the bank or a small margin to the bank when it really isn't. So if there's one thing to remember, that I'm not blaming the consumer entirely on this, but there is a set of expectations that I think a combination of media, polling organizations, polling aggregators have created a level of expectation about the precision of polls that really they can't ever live up to, even as methodologies arguably improve in some ways. So I put it a little bit back on all of us to be a little more conscious of that.
Yeah, I really like the blame the consumer approach. I do think, I appreciate Lynn's defense of this, and I think she's right. But I tell you, and I think all of us share this concern. Our response rates are down in the low single digits at this point. That is, every 100 people I call, I'm lucky if I get a couple of completed interviews. We've been waging this war to, do things to increase response rates, increase our cell phone percentages and stuff like that. But it's pretty clear the kinds of things. Lynn didn't talk much about her methodology, but Lucid does this sort of river sampling, which takes advantage of all these different streams of data. We're going to have to test these and judge their validity in relatively short order because we're going to have to transition pretty soon. The old landline, the wonderful, golden age of landline phones. So great with the landlines. But nobody has landlines anymore, and I know, and we get you guys. We sample you.
Over and
over and over, yeah. But it's, we're clearly going to wake up one morning pretty soon, and I think we're going to have to make a judgment about moving to online sampling, moving to digital sampling in a much more systematic way. And we're transitioning, but there are questions about trends and data comparability, and we're not quite sure how to treat some of those right now. But the change is coming.
It's already here.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you all.
Yeah.
I like that they